In the heart of Amritsar, a holy city, there is a piece of land, a garden. Its name is Jallianwala Bagh. Before April of 1919, it was an uneven patch of earth, a forgotten space enclosed by the high brick walls of surrounding houses, accessible only by a few narrow lanes. It was a place for public gatherings, for travelers to rest, for children to play. After April 1919, it became something else entirely. It became a wound in the memory of a nation, a permanent monument to a day when the machinery of empire stripped off its velvet glove to reveal an iron fist slick with blood. The ground itself remembers. The walls still bear the scars. How does a place of community become a killing field? How does an officer, a man of duty and discipline trained to protect the empire, become the architect of a massacre against the very people he is meant to rule? What is the calculus of terror that decides a moral lesson must be written in the lives of unarmed men, women, and children? These are not questions for history alone. They are questions about the nature of power, the fragility of morality, and the terrifying speed with which order can transform into atrocity. The story of Jallianwala Bagh is the story of a system, an ideology of dominance, reaching its most logical and horrific conclusion in 10 minutes of ceaseless, calculated gunfire. The final official count would be 379 dead, with over 1,000 wounded. Indian sources would insist the true number of fatalities was far, far higher. But the most precise number, the one that tells the truest story of intent, was 1,950. That was the number of rounds fired deliberately, fired methodically, fired until the ammunition was nearly exhausted. This was not a riot being dispersed. This was an execution. And in its aftermath, the British Empire in India, though it would limp on for another 3 decades, had suffered a mortal blow, delivered by its own hand in a quiet garden in Punjab. The nightmare that bloomed in Amritsar did not begin there. Its seeds were planted more than 60 years earlier, in the searing heat of 1857. The Indian Rebellion, which the British called the Sepoy Mutiny, was the foundational trauma of the Raj. It was a bloody, chaotic, and vicious conflict that shattered the complacent illusion of a benevolent British rule over a grateful native population. For the British, it was a terrifying spectacle of their own vulnerability, a vision of being overwhelmed and slaughtered far from home. The memory of Cawnpur and Delhi, of massacres of European civilians, was burned into the psyche of the colonial administration. From that trauma, a governing philosophy was born. It was a philosophy of fear, masked by an ideology of racial superiority. The Indian was now seen as inherently untrustworthy, a subject to be ruled, not a partner to be governed. The apparatus of the state, the civil service, the police, the army, was reconfigured around a central principle: any sign of native, insubordination, any hint of organized resistance must be met with overwhelming and disproportionate force. The ghost of 1857 haunted every viceroy's palace and every remote military cantonment. It whispered that hesitation was weakness, and weakness was death. This paranoia became the bedrock upon which the actions of April 1919 were built. The chosen location for this philosophy's ultimate expression was Amritsar, the spiritual center of the Sikh faith. The city was a bustling hub of trade and a potent symbol of Indian identity. At its heart lay the Jallianwala Bagh. It was not a manicured park in the English style, but an open space, a depression in the ground, hemmed in on all sides by the backs of houses and buildings. Its walls were tall, between 5 and 10 feet high. It had 5 very narrow entrances, some so small that only one person could pass at a time. The main entrance was the only one wide enough for a vehicle. This geography, so innocuous on any other day, had created a perfect, inescapable trap. The garden was waiting for its grim purpose. The first signs of the coming storm appeared not on the battlefield, but on the pages of legislation. India had contributed massively to the British war effort in the First World War, sending over 1 million soldiers to fight and die for the empire. The political classes in India hoped, naively, that this sacrifice would be rewarded with greater self-governance. Instead, they were handed the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act of 1919. Universally known as the Rowlatt Acts, they were a slap in the face. These laws extended wartime emergency powers into peacetime, allowing the authorities to imprison any suspected revolutionary without trial, to silence the press and to quash dissent with an iron fist. The acts were the spark in a political tinderbox. They were seen as a profound betrayal, proof that Britain had no intention of loosening its grip. In response, a new form of protest championed by Mohandas Gandhi swept the subcontinent, the Hartal, a nationwide strike and day of non-violent resistance. The enabling conditions for disaster were now all in place: a restive and resentful population, a new and powerful tool of non-violent protest, and a colonial government conditioned by 60 years of paranoia to see every protest as the prelude to a new mutiny. In Punjab, these conditions were amplified by the province's governor, Lieutenant Governor Michael O'Dwyer. He was a man of the old school, a firm believer in absolute authority who saw the rising tide of Indian nationalism not as a political movement, but as a seditious disease that required surgical removal. The pattern of escalation began in early April. The Hartal in Amritsar on April 6th was a massive success and remarkably peaceful. But the administration saw only defiance. On April 10th, O'Dwyer ordered the arrest and deportation of 2 popular local leaders, Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal, when a crowd of protesters marched peacefully toward the deputy commissioner's residence to demand their release. They were met by soldiers who opened fire, killing several. The peace was broken. The crowd, now a mob, turned its fury on the symbols of British authority. They attacked banks, burned the town hall, and killed 5 European civilians. For the British in Punjab, this was it. This was 1857 all over again. The reports sent to provincial command were hysterical, speaking of open rebellion and a city fallen to insurrectionists. The machinery of repression swung into motion. On the evening of April 11th, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer arrived and took effective command of the city. He was 54 years old, born in India, a career soldier who knew no other life. He was the physical embodiment of the system's paranoia, a man who saw the world in starkly simple terms: order and chaos, loyalty and sedition, us and them. His methodology was immediate and absolute. He imposed a de facto martial law, restricting movement and assembly. His primary tool was not negotiation but intimidation. On the morning of April 13th, the day of the Baisakhi festival, a major religious holiday for Sikhs and Hindus, Dyer organized a procession through the city. He stood in his motor car, flanked by his troops, and had a proclamation read out at various points. The proclamation banned all public gatherings of 4 or more people. Anyone defying the order would be dispersed by force of arms. It was a direct and unambiguous threat. The psychological landscape of General Dyer at this moment was that of a man convinced of his own righteousness and the absolute necessity of his actions. He did not see the citizens of Amritsar as people with legitimate grievances. He saw them as children who needed a firm hand, or worse, as rebels who needed to be crushed. In his mind, the violence of April 10th had nullified any claim to peaceful protest. He believed he was standing on the precipice of a widespread revolt that threatened to engulf the entire province of Punjab. He felt the weight of the empire on his shoulders. He was not there to keep the peace. He was there to teach a lesson that would be remembered for generations. His mind had already compartmentalized the population into a single entity: the enemy. A tragic near discovery, a failure of communication that sealed the fate of hundreds, occurred with Dyer's proclamation. The procession did not cover the entire city. The proclamation, read in English and Urdu, was not understood by many. Crucially, thousands of people had already poured into Amritsar from the surrounding villages. They were pilgrims, not protesters. They had come for the Baisakhi festival, to visit the Golden Temple, to trade at the cattle fair. They had no knowledge of the political turmoil of the preceding days, and they certainly had no knowledge of General Dyer's order. They gathered in Jallianwala Bagh that afternoon simply because it was a traditional meeting place, a space to rest and talk before returning to their villages. The truth of their innocence was there, but the authorities, blinded by fear, failed to see it. The zenith of horror arrived just after 4 in the afternoon on April 13th. Word reached General Dyer that a large crowd had assembled in the Bagh in direct defiance of his order. For him, this was not a gathering of festival goers. It was the rebel army he had been expecting. He made his decision instantly. There would be no warnings. There would be no attempt to disperse the crowd peacefully. He gathered a force of 90 soldiers, 50 riflemen from the Gurkhas and other regiments, and 40 Gurkhas armed only with kukris. He took them along with 2 armored cars mounted with machine guns and marched towards the garden. He entered the Bagh via the main, widest entrance. He saw the crowd before him, a sea of some 20,000 people packed into the sunken enclosure. A speaker was addressing them from a small platform. Families were sitting on the grass, some with picnic baskets. Children were running about. Dyer did not hesitate. He deployed his troops on the raised bank on either side of the entrance, effectively sealing it. His armored cars, with their powerful machine guns, could not fit through the narrow passage. It was his only regret of the day. The invisible victims sat below him, utterly oblivious to their fate. They were farmers, merchants, laborers, and their families. They were Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. They had names: Ratan Devi, whose husband Madan Mohan would die before her eyes; Udham Singh, a young orphan who would survive and carry the memory of the slaughter for 2 decades. Countless others whose identities are now lost, reduced to a statistic. They were not a mob. They were the people of Punjab. In that moment, before the first shot was fired, they represented the human reality that the imperial system had ceased to see. In this condensed, terrifying theater of operations, society did not just look away. It was entirely absent. There were no other authorities present to question Dyer's judgment. There was no magistrate, as was legally required for an order to fire on a civilian crowd. Dyer was the prosecutor, judge, and executioner. The system that had granted him this absolute power, the military and civil hierarchy of the Raj, had created a situation where one man's paranoid conviction could unleash unlimited violence without any check or balance. The institutional safeguards had not just failed. They had been designed to fail in precisely such a moment. Without a single word of warning, he gave the order to fire. The soldiers knelt and aimed, not over the heads of the people, but directly into the densest parts of the crowd. The first volley of .303 Lee Enfield rounds tore into the unsuspecting gathering. A sound of cracking whips was followed by a wave of screams. Panic erupted. People scrambled to their feet, desperate to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The high walls trapped them. The narrow exits became clogged with bodies, creating impassable human dams. Dyer directed his men's fire with cold, tactical precision. He ordered them to shoot at the exits where the crowds were thickest. He saw people trying to scale the sheer brick walls and ordered his men to pick them off. The firing was not in volleys. It was continuous, individual soldiers reloading and firing as fast as they could. The ground became a carpet of the dead and dying. A deep well in one corner of the garden became a tomb as dozens leaped in to escape the bullets, only to be crushed or drowned by those who fell on top of them. 120 bodies would later be pulled from that well alone. For 10 minutes, the firing did not stop. It only ceased when the soldiers' ammunition was almost completely spent. They had fired 1,650 rounds. Having delivered his moral lesson, General Dyer ordered his troops to withdraw. He marched them back to their barracks, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. He made no arrangements for the wounded. In fact, he enforced his citywide curfew with even greater stringency, meaning that for the entire night, relatives were prevented from searching for their loved ones. The wounded were left to bleed to death in the dark, crying out for water amongst the piles of the dead. This final act of cruelty, the denial of aid, was perhaps the most damning of all. The first cracks in the edifice of imperial justification began to appear with Dyer's own words. In his official report, he showed no remorse. He was, in fact, proud of his actions. He stated that he had confronted a revolutionary army and that his use of force was not just justified but necessary. This chilling self-assurance was an internal pressure that would eventually rupture the official narrative. He had overreached so dramatically, his brutality had been so naked that it became impossible to sanitize. The system had produced a monster, and the monster was now boasting of his deeds. External pressures began to build as news of the massacre, initially suppressed by martial law and press censorship, started to leak out of Punjab. Indian nationalist leaders were horrified and began their own inquiries. Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel laureate, renounced his knighthood in protest, writing to the viceroy that the disproportionate severity of the punishment inflicted upon the unfortunate people are without parallel in the history of civilized governments. In London, the Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, began to receive disturbing reports. The story could not be contained. The true breakthrough, the moment when the full horror was laid bare for the world, came with the establishment of the Disorders Inquiry Committee chaired by Lord Hunter. It was tasked with investigating the recent unrest in India. In November 1919, General Dyer was called to testify. Under cross-examination, he felt no need for contrition or evasion. His testimony was a confession, delivered with the arrogance of a man who believed he had done no wrong. He admitted he had ordered his troops to fire without warning. He confirmed that he would have used his armored car's machine guns if he could have gotten them into the Bagh. When asked if his intention was merely to disperse the crowd, he gave the answer that would condemn him in the eyes of history. He said no. He had fired, he explained, to produce a sufficient moral effect, not only on those present, but throughout the whole of Punjab. He admitted he had continued firing even as the crowd was trying to flee. He acknowledged leaving the wounded to their fate. His own words, printed in newspapers across the globe, destroyed any pretense that this was a necessary action to restore order. He had admitted under oath to committing a punitive massacre designed to terrorize an entire population into submission. The Hunter Commission's investigation acted as the formal revelation, the official raid on the crime scene. The members visited the garden, still pockmarked with bullet holes. They heard harrowing testimony from survivors who described the carnage, the search for loved ones in the dark, the piles of bodies. The physical evidence of the place and the emotional evidence of the witnesses created an irrefutable account. The horror was no longer a rumor. It was a documented fact. The machinery of the British state was now forced to confront the actions of its own agent. The accounting came in the form of the Commission's final report, published in 1920. It was a fractured document, reflecting the deep divisions the massacre had created. The British members of the Commission, in their majority report, condemned Dyer's actions. They concluded he had committed a grave error of judgment and had acted beyond what was necessary. They censured him for firing without warning and for continuing to fire for too long. However, they stopped short of calling it a massacre, framing it instead as a tragic overreaction. the Indian members issued a separate minority report using far stronger language. They condemned Dyer's actions as inhuman and un-British, arguing that he had deliberately set out to punish and terrorize. The official body count was tallied at 379 dead. This number, based on incomplete data and a desire to minimize the scale of the event, was immediately and has been perpetually disputed. The Indian National Congress, which conducted its own parallel inquiry, estimated the death toll at over 1,000. The precise number will never be known. The victims were cremated or buried quickly without proper records. But the number itself, whether 379 or 1 on 200, could not capture the scale of the atrocity. The true accounting was in the act itself, the cold, systematic slaughter of a trapped and defenseless crowd. General Dyer's reckoning was not a criminal trial for murder, but a series of administrative and political consequences. Based on the Hunter report, he was relieved of his command. The commander-in-chief in India declared him unfit for further employment. He was forced to resign from the army. In the British House of Commons, a debate raged. Winston Churchill, then Secretary of State for War, delivered a powerful speech condemning Dyer's actions as an episode which appears to me to be without precedent or parallel in the modern history of the British Empire. An extraordinary event, a monstrous event, an event which stands in singular and sinister isolation. The Commons voted to approve the government's mild censure of Dyer, but the House of Lords voted to support him. More shockingly, a significant portion of the British public rallied to his cause. The conservative Morning Post newspaper started a fund for the man who saved India, raising the astonishing sum of £26,000 for him, the equivalent of millions today. He was presented with a Sword of Honor. This schism laid bare the moral sickness at the heart of the imperial project. For many in Britain, Dyer was not a butcher. He was a hero who had held the line, a bulwark against chaos. They saw the people in the garden not as victims, but as rebels who got what they deserved. The reckoning for Dyer was incomplete, but the reckoning for the myth of a benevolent empire had begun. The aftermath for the survivors and the families of the dead was a lifetime of trauma. They received little to no compensation. For decades, they fought for official acknowledgement of the true scale of the massacre and for an apology from the British government that never came in a full and formal sense. The city of Amritsar itself was scarred. The memory of the crawling order, an infamous decree by Dyer forcing Indians to crawl on their bellies along a street where a British woman had been assaulted, and the public floggings that accompanied martial law, left a legacy of humiliation and bitterness that festered for generations. The failures of the system were profound. The initial cover-up through censorship, the official undercounting of the dead, and the ultimate failure to prosecute Dyer or anyone else for the killings demonstrated that, under the rules of empire, the life of a colonial subject had a different value. Justice was not blind. It was definitively on the side of the colonizer. The celebration of Dyer as a hero in Britain was a moral catastrophe, a societal failure to confront the brutal reality of what was being done in its name. The system protected its own, even when they committed monstrous acts. The cultural legacy of Jallianwala Bagh was transformative. For the Indian independence movement, it was the point of no return. The massacre extinguished any lingering faith among Indian nationalists in British justice or good intentions. It convinced millions, including moderates like Gandhi, that reform was impossible and that complete self-rule, Purna Swaraj, was the only acceptable goal. The garden became a sacred place, a site of national pilgrimage. The story radicalized a new generation of revolutionaries who saw violence not as a first resort, but as a legitimate response to an inherently violent state. The bloodshed in the bog fertilized the soil from which Indian independence would grow. What then is the concluding moral of this garden of death? It is a stark lesson in how easily the rhetoric of order, security, and stability can be used to justify mass murder. The massacre was not an aberration performed by a single rogue general. It was the logical, if extreme, culmination of a system built on racial hierarchy and the right of one people to rule another by force. General Dyer was not a madman. He was a true believer in that system, and his actions were the faithful execution of its underlying paranoid logic. The warning signs were there for decades, in the casual violence of colonial policing, in the dehumanizing language of imperial administration, in the deep-seated fear of the other. We owe the dead of Amritsar more than just remembrance. We owe them the recognition that they were not collateral damage in the maintenance of an empire. They were individuals, men, women, and children, murdered by a state that had ceased to see their humanity. Their tragedy compels us to ask uncomfortable questions of our own time. Where do we see the same logic at work today? Where is the fear of a population used to justify the stripping of their rights? Where is the language of security used to excuse brutality? The ghosts of Jallianwala Bagh are a warning. They remind us that civilization is a thin veneer, and that the distance between a garden and a grave is sometimes only a single command.